Thank you for being here again. I think you can hear me better without this. Today we're in chapter 12 of N.T. Wright's biography of the Apostle Paul. The title is Corinth 2, but it's not so much about Corinth as it is about what he did when he was in Corinth the second time he was there. And today we'll be looking at his writings to various churches when he was incarcerated in Rome, particularly his second letter to the church at Corinth. Now here's the trail that Paul took to get to where he was over in Greece at the time. The trail that Paul used took him from Antioch in Syria up through Asia and then over across Asia Minor. And there he visited a few cities that he took on earlier in his first and second trips, and eventually it continues on up into Greece. That was his destination for this particular trip. During that trip, we know that he visited Philippi, Athens, and Corinth. Here's a question for you. Did you know that there are books that are not, but could have been included in our Bible? Books that were actually written by the apostles. You knew that? Jack knew it. Some books that were written by the apostles, and we're going to talk about that today. What does that do to your faith, though? I mean, think about it as we go through this. What does it do, the fact that is our Bible as complete as it should be? So, in order to talk about that, we need to talk about the canon of the Bible, and forever I heard that as a child and thought it was meant that the Bible could blow other people away if you brought it up and used it in your discussion with them, but it doesn't mean anything that shoots cannonballs. And if you notice, when people say the canon of the Bible, that word is spelled with one N and not two. That's how you differentiate between the two, I suppose, when you're looking at the word. The canon are the books that are regarded by the religious community as authoritative scripture. Do you know much about the non-canonical apocryphal books? How much do you know about the Apocrypha? Have you ever read any of them? But you know it's there, right? You know there are writings that some people attune to and think should be part of the Bible, and then there are others, like myself, who feel like they really don't belong there. And I'm glad they're not there, honestly. And these books are just something that an editor chose somewhere along the way, and they did not make it in the canon of the Bible, because there were strict standards for determining what should and shouldn't be included, right? Here are possible contenders, a whole bunch of them up there. They're not included, and there are some just reasons for not including each of these. I'm telling you there are missing books, but it's none of these. We're not talking about these books that are not in the version of the Bible that we look at when we open it today. There are other books that are out there written by the apostles that are just not there. Now, I'm also not talking about what the scholars of the day call pseudepigraphic, or also called the Deutero-Pauline books. There's some evidence that suggests that some of these books may not have been written by Paul, but rather by someone who was very familiar with Paul, who was in a Paul school, if you will, and was able to write like Paul would write, and they wrote these books. Could the Gospel of Mark not have been written by John Mark that accompanied Paul on the missionary journey? His book is considered epigraphical, but these books have been put forth possibly as not being written by the Apostle Paul. Does that make you worry about your Bible a little bit? The fact that there are people out there that suggest that these books were not written by the Apostle Paul himself, but written by some school of Paul's at the time, by people who could write and would write like the Apostle Paul. This is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about any of that. Put all that stuff behind you, but this is what I'm talking about. There are two letters that have been proven to exist at one point, but these two letters did not make it in the Bible. Paul wrote two letters to Corinth, right? Two letters, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But actually, if you read Corinthians, you'll find that there were 4 letters that Paul wrote. In 1 Corinthians, Paul mentions having written an earlier letter. So 1 Corinthians really ought to be labeled 2 Corinthians. But guess what? In 2 Corinthians, he refers to an earlier letter that he sent to them then. So 2 Corinthians really ought to be 4 Corinthians. 1, 2, 3, 4 Corinthians. Wouldn't you like to have those other letters just to see what's in them? But that's biblical. I mean, that literally is what we know. Paul wrote these letters. We just don't have them. Now, you can think about that. Would you not like to have those letters? Do you think it would have changed the understanding that we have of the apostles' message if we had those letters? Was there anything new and different in there that we don't have that we already have in the version of the scriptures that we have, the Apostle Paul? Anyhow, I wanted you to know that. There were actually 4 of them. And here are the events that occurred that put that in place. In 49 to 52 AD, he visited Corinth for about 18 months. Paul tells us in Ephesus that he wrote Corinth a warning letter, and that letter is now lost. And Paul writes his first letter, 1 Corinthians 5:19. He claims ownership of that letter. And then Paul made a painful visit that he promised, and he wrote a letter of tears from Ephesus, which is the third one. And then finally, Paul writes 2 Corinthians. Altogether, there were 4 letters to the Corinthians. We also don't have Paul's letter of the mystery of his revelation that he wrote to the Ephesians. And we don't have a copy of the letter of Paul to the Laodiceans, because he told the Corinthians to send their letter to the Laodiceans and also get the Laodiceans' letter and read it. Wouldn't you like to know what he wrote to the Laodiceans? But we don't have a version of it. There's no copy of it. There's no text available for us to look at. So here's the real question. The real question is this: does having references to letters that we don't have pose a problem for the Bible? Does it pose a problem for the Bible that we read? Well, the answer is yes, if you assume that everything that was written needed to be preserved. In other words, there could be no loss of any of those documents, and that a missing letter is a mistake somehow, or that vital information is missing if we don't have those letters. And for the most part, I don't think that there are 3 of those that we have, so it doesn't really shake my faith in the Bible. How about yours? Are any of you shaking this morning in your faith? No, good, great, because I'd hate to have shook you up in your belief. Wright mentions there are major stylistic differences between the first and second letters to the Corinthians, and that's so true. The first letter is more downbeat. The second letter is downbeat for a while, but it gets more upbeat as you go along. Wright says the second letter seems, he used the term jerkier, and no one's ever accused me of being jerky in what I wrote, but he's saying he flitters around a little bit. He doesn't stay on track. And he's jerkier in overall structure. He jumps from one topic to the next topic very quickly without any discussion. It just, all of a sudden, you're talking about something completely different. Paul's arguments seem longer and they're more complex in the 2 Corinthian letter. And it turns into a sudden and upbeat happy ending when everything in those 13, 14 chapters before that was down. Everything was dark and gloomy. They were agonizing chapters. And Wright wonders if 2 Corinthians possibly was not written by Paul. But he says that's only a question that he has in his mind. Philemon was told earlier to expect a visit from Paul. And he was a wealthy landowner, had a large house, probably many servants. He lived in the city of Colossae. And the church of Colossae met in Philemon's home. Onesimus was a slave who ran away to Paul, and Paul told him, "You have to go back to your master," and he sent him along with a letter. And he arrived with this letter in hand from Paul to his master, as we talked about last week. And that letter we know as Philemon. All told, Paul wrote 4 letters from prison in Rome. The current thinking is that all of those were written from Rome while he was in prison there. Here are some of the places that Paul had been incarcerated. He had been in jail in Philippi. he was brought before the authorities in Jerusalem. They put him in a holding cell or a house where he was maintained and sequestered there until he was able to have his trial before Festus. In Caesarea, they put him in a holding cell also, under guard in Herod's palace in Caesarea. And he awaited for a long time a trial that never occurred. And then finally, he was under house arrest in Rome. And during his final missionary journey, he wrote 4 prison letters. He wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Now, Paul wrote this statement to the Corinthians in his second letter, known by our former President Trump as 2 Corinthians, just so you know where we are in the Bible. The sorrowful letter does not seem to be referencing 1 Corinthians, right? Paul says, I sent a sorrowful letter. When you read 1 Corinthians, do you get a lot of sorrow from that letter from Paul? I don't. I don't see a lot of sorrow in that. So let's assume the letter was lost somehow. Does this statement cause concern for your faith in the rest of the Bible? Now, we might also assume that he was referencing the first letter that he sent them, and some people suggest that that letter that Paul referenced in 1 Corinthians is really a reference to the letter itself. I don't quite get that, but most scholars don't believe that. His sorrowful letter is simply lost to us. So, I'd like to know how you feel. How do you feel about the fact that there are letters out there that we've never seen, we've never read, that were written by the hand of Paul? I'd love to, wouldn't you? I would read those. I think if somebody came up with an authoritative statement that they had found the letter that Paul said that he wrote to them that we think has been lost all these years, I would certainly want to read that letter. I know there are other 3 that are out there that I'd like to read as well. You're probably the same way. But does it shake your faith any? There was I believe there was probably some God looking down and making sure that these at least made it to us today in the form that we recognize it as the Bible. Our children think that this Bible is a book that was written from beginning to end by somebody. They need to know, I think they need to understand a little bit about the history of how that Bible came together. And this is just a little bit of a wrinkle in the whole fabric of what the Bible is. Just a small wrinkle. It's nothing, I don't think, that I would worry too much about. But it is there. A lot of people don't know about that. Why would Paul in 2 Corinthians deal so much with him being boastful? He says, I know I'm boasting here. And he boasts about all the troubles that he faced. You know, he said he was in prison many times. 5 times he was beaten. And many times he was beaten. And 5 of those times were the hard kinds of beating. 40 beats, 40 strikes, -1, because they were always afraid we'd give someone 41 and then they would be in trouble for doing that. So they always stopped at 39. He was beaten like that 5 times. He was beaten terribly, almost to the point of death. Once he was even stoned, if you recall. They came out from the city walls and they found him and they stoned him. And he laid there for a while and finally woke up or got up and walked away. He was shipwrecked once. He spent a night in the sea, a night and a day in the sea. And his travels he always faced danger. He faced hunger, and he said he was cold and exposed to the elements. So why would Paul mention these psychological and these physical burdens? Paul is almost, if you look at this, berating himself. He said, if I embarrass you in the weaknesses that I'm showing you of mine, it's understandable. If I offended you, I feel very ashamed about that. How about this? I was pursued by the king of Artias, and I didn't stand up to him and fight. What did I do? I got in a basket in a house. They lowered me down to the street, and I ran away. I was not strong enough to trust in God and stay and confront him. Instead, I was lowered through a window and I fled. And I am so embarrassed about this, as I probably should be. Now, that was Paul talking about all the hard times that he'd had, and yet he brings them up in a letter and goes over them one at a time with the people. So everybody knew exactly what happened. Why would he do that? Why would he do that? Well, in Latin, you could say this was his cursus pedorum. Have any of you ever written the cursus honorium, which is honor orium, honor I-U-M, however you would pronounce that? There's a cursus honorium, and I'll bet some of you in here have written one of those, and that would be your resume. That would be your resume. But Paul's was not writing his resume. He was not writing a cursus honorium. He was writing an pedorium. It shows all our cursus honorium, or our resume, shows all the little tiny steps that you took in education and how every time you moved up in life until you are where you are today. It works from the bottom and always moves up. A Roman officer would have been quick to point all the glory and fame that he achieved in all of his wars. And in each case, it enabled him to move up the ladder of fortune and power as a military leader. But Paul goes the other way. All these times I was beaten. I was shipwrecked. I was hungry, thirsty along the way. He lists all of these things, so he's not doing a resume as you or I understand that. Instead, his resume is upside down. Here's my shame list. I am shameful in all of this. There's nothing for me to boast about. But here's the thing. God considers my shame his glory. And then Paul moves into his spiritual experiences. In chapter 12, he lists his spiritual experiences, but he's quite reticent. He doesn't really come out and say, I am the one here I'm talking about. So he says, I know someone. I know someone who was snatched up into the third heaven 14 years ago. And he heard words that humans are not allowed to repeat. A man like this I would boast, but not me, for I am weak. In other words, I've got a lot to put on my list, on my resume. If you want to see it, I should add that one at the very beginning so you see that I did that. But I'm not doing that. Instead, I'm showing you all the shameful things to help you understand that I am strong today because of all these things that I did and how God has brought me all along on this journey. I've had extraordinary experiences, but these are not what allows me to stand before you as an apostle. And he said, for all of this, I have not received a crown. Is Paul whining a little bit there? Is Paul saying, look at all these things I had to endure, and for that, I did not receive a crown? Instead, what did he receive? He received a thorn in the flesh, something that was with him as a reminder all of his life. It probably was a physical illness of some kind or a special nagging temptation that kept coming back to him routinely, a sense of worthlessness, and sorrow and shame for his public anger at Barnabas. If I ever get a chance to talk to Paul, I'm going to say, how in the world could you feel the way you feel about yourself and the way you wrote about yourself in 1st and 2nd Corinthians? I just don't understand it. You are God's man. It's clearly evident. And here you are talking about and boasting almost in the things that you are ashamed of. But he told what the Corinthians needed to hear. He said, I boast, but my boast is in Christ because I am weak, but he is strong. If I boast all the more about my weakness, it gets me more of Christ's power. I'll be delighted in weakness if Christ's power is displayed in me. In other words, he's saying, when I am weak, you see, I am strong. That's when I'm at my strongest, because God is there with me in those times when I'm weak. And he winds up by saying, I have not received yet a crown. Paul was coming to realize that nothing he could have done was worth the grace that God extended to him along the way. And we are all saved by faith in Jesus, but we're saved by God's grace. And there's nothing we can do to deserve it. There's nothing that we do that can give us that assurance. It's something that Christ does for us when he was here. He died for us. Well, Wright has a lot to say in 2 Corinthians. It's a very in-depth study. More to say in the book about his second visit to Corinth. And we've covered the first half, but the second half demands as much or more attention. So please read the entire book of 2 Corinthians and find out why Paul needed to say what he did, and it's certainly an important lesson to us. Romans, which he wrote very closely to the time that he wrote Corinthians, is probably in Wright's mind the most ecstatic and exhilarating book that you can read. It's dense and difficult. It's intellectually, spiritually challenged. We get such reward from reading basically any period in church history, and Romans is certainly no different. Any questions, comments, snotty remarks? No? Okay. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the class and being with you today. Thank you. Thank you.